as we lurch into the future in this blitzkrieg of idiocy, Facebook likes, fascist marches, fake news coups, and what looks like a race towards extinction, what is literature's place? What counts as literature? Who decides?
There should be dissent from orthodoxy. Not just about Islam, but about anything. Anything.
Even though we didn't have a say, it is you.
A local teacher fired after showing students a video titled White Privilege.
I was given no explanation.
Belarus used one of its fighter jets to force an Irish passenger plane to land.
Today, the free expression of writers,
Controversy over a school library book,
journalists,
fake news,
True or false?
artists,
A satirical cartoonist accused of blasphemy.
and citizens of all kinds is threatened as never before. With disinformation and authoritarianism on the rise, PEN America fights back.
Until a couple of months ago, Oleg Sentsov was incarcerated in a Russian prison.
Thanks to PEN American members and other people who supported me and other Ukrainian hostages during all of this time.
We bring the world's attention to threats against expression.
I would like to say thank you very much. I'm really happy and excited to see my family and my colleagues.
We defend academic freedom and fight disinformation.
We turn to our courts and they upheld the First Amendment and press freedom.
If you think a headline isn't true, don't share it or like it or hit forward.
Speak up for those who do not have the chance to speak for themselves.
For PEN as an organization, it should be heartening to realize that it turns out the pen is mightier than the sword.
PEN America reveres the place of literature in society. Our mission is to unite all types of writers and their allies to celebrate free expression and defend the liberties that make it possible.
For nearly a century now, PEN America has stood as a staunch guardian of literary expression and human rights.
The freedom to tell stories is fundamental to our First Amendment freedoms, and we're not about to just forfeit that.
Join us. Stand up for free expression. And to every kind of writer, we are with you. We will defend you. We will never stop fighting for you.
Welcome and good evening, everyone. My name is Drew Menaker, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at PEN America. We're doing this event, of course, at a time of some uncertainty in terms of the pandemic. So we're really thrilled that we could have an opportunity to accommodate some of you in a live audience and give our panel real people to interact with. And of course, we want to extend our warm greetings to the bulk of our audience joining us virtually from coast to coast. Good evening to everyone. This is our yearly town hall. It stands as the annual general meeting for PEN America, a gathering of our membership and a testament to the participation that powers us in our shared mission to protect and celebrate free expression. If some of you are not members yet, please join us. You can be a member as a writer or as a reader, as an advocate for free expression, as an opponent of banning books, as an ally of writers under threat around the world, as a lover of the joy of what the written word can bring into our lives. And for any of those reasons and many more, please be a part of our community of PEN America, whether you're a member of the literary community or as a friend to it. To become a member or to renew your membership, please see one of my colleagues outside in the lobby or go to our website, pen.org. I can't emphasize enough how important the support is to the urgent work we have at hand during these complicated times. So first, a few housekeeping notes for those of you in the room. We'd very much appreciate it if you would remain masked for the duration of our event. Second, in the town hall style, we want to make sure our audiences are part of the conversation. So for those of you in person, there'll be an opportunity at the mic to ask questions, and I hope a line for doing so. Please think about what you want to ask during our event. And I'm told that our online chat is open now, so please join in that conversation for those of you with us virtually, and submit your questions there. We'll gather them and share them with the panel. Also, I want to say that as a member-based organization, PEN America's trustees are voted on by PEN America's professional members in good standing. We do this election online, and from the results, we can now formally welcome to the Board of Trustees the following people for their first term. So welcome to Maria Rana, Peter Barbie, Wesley Morris, Anya Salama, Luis Alberto Urrea, and Tara Westover. We're so glad to have each of them join us on the board, and we very much appreciate the time and incredible support all of our trustees bring to PEN America. Many of them are here with us tonight. And finally, for those of you in the room, please do stay after the discussion. We're going to have a reception just outside in the lobby, and I think it's a good time for us all to get reacquainted. That includes meeting our PEN America colleagues who are here tonight. While I have the floor, and as the year draws to a close, I'd just like to give a heartfelt shout out to the brilliant staff of PEN America. They introduce us to amazing writers, they stage remarkable events, they battle to defend free expression rights, to protect workers and writers and artists around the world, and to find and nurture our staff, to bring our messages to a global audience, to raise the money to make it possible, to carefully monitor that money, and just generally to keep us moving forward overall. It's an amazing team, and I want to thank them. So now I'm pleased to introduce PEN America's president, Ayad Akhtar. As I'm sure you all know, he's a novelist and a playwright, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Drama, and most recently author of the acclaimed Homeland Elegies. He joined PEN America in 2015, and he's just now finishing his first year as president. So please join me in welcoming Ayad. And there he is.
Thank you, Drew. Welcome, fellow PEN members, to our annual general meeting. Just down here. We have a panel today addressing the matter of self-censorship. And before we get there, I'd like to say a few words in anticipation of what I expect to be a lively discussion. It's a complicated time, to say the least. There appears to be less and less commitment among a growing contingent of us to the bedrock value of freedom of expression. Increasingly, those who might otherwise have felt it important to defend free speech at all costs have come to wonder if the so-called harm done by certain forms of speech are of greater moment and consequence than the so-called freedom to speak in ways that could inflict such harm. An evolving set of beliefs about the kinds of harms we should no longer tolerate is creating increasingly its own political culture. And on the other side of this ever-deepening divide, we find a deeply cynical defense of freedom of expression, but really as something more like a revolt against what I suspect many in this room would see as the arc of history bending finally toward justice. As writers, many of us are caught in the middle. Our creative imaginations are not discursive, but organic. We are pulled where the muses and where the fertile blind spots in our lives lead us. And so the molting complexion of the public space, where language is increasingly politicized even when it's not, where the argument over representation can feel increasingly like a matter of jurisprudence as opposed to creativity, in a public space being reshaped to these exigencies, it is not without consequence to us all as writers. In this year's Philip Roth lecture, published in this month's Atlantic magazine, I laid out an involved case for what I suspect is a prime mover with regards to changing public discourse these days. Engagement technology that has us addicted to the delivery devices where so much of our lives are now taking place. Surveillance capitalism, if you will, which has a fundamental principle keeping us connected to the monetizing machine, and doing so by ceaselessly confirming our biases. I bring this up only to say that the incentives of online discourse have increasingly led to the creation of groupings of opinion, pitted one against the other, agglomerations of outrage, not just left-leaning or right-leaning, groupings superintended by slogans of belonging and creedal statements honed like trademarks to the very locution. The result is a widespread and punitive stridency descending upon us from every quarter. Part of the challenge of being a writer today, then, is not to be cowed by fear, however real, of opprobrium, retaliation, and group exclusion. The writer today must know that her best work is likely to come from a path that can only lead from her own sense of things and not from the pressing parameters of our prevailing groupthink. Attention paid to her own affinities, however heterodox they may be. But in the end, any defense of the freedom to write can only be as strong as those willing to heed it. Such strength, it's important to add, is not rewarded these days, a time when so many are telling us how and what and why we must write. Just a few words in closing about the year we've had for the organization. The battle over the American classroom and what can be taught there rages, and we have been active in opposing any legislation that limits what can and can't be taught about our nation's history. We continue to be focused on our initiatives across the country at PEN America and new chapter cities and doing what we can to support local news in those communities. Our literary programs are flourishing, the annual awards, the World Voices Festival, and the PEN Out Loud series. The pandemic is, of course, still with us, and so in addition to programming, still finding its balance between online and in-person events, staff members at PEN America are also now slowly reacclimatizing to an in-person environment that includes work from home as well. Finally, this promises to be an important year. Poised to celebrate our 100th anniversary, I'm thrilled to announce we've received a transformative gift of $10 million from the Edwin Barbie Charitable Trust to establish the PEN Barbie Freedom to Write Center, which will enhance our ability to work worldwide to defend free expression. And finally, our prison and justice writing program is anticipating the release next month of a 350-page publication entitled The Sentences That Create Us, Crafting a Writer's Life in Prison. Thanks to a grant from the Mellon Foundation, we will be donating 75,000 copies of the book to prison libraries nationwide. Thank you for being here tonight. Please refer your literary friends, your reading friends, for membership. Thanks for your commitment and for reminding us through all your accomplishments as writers yourselves why we do what we do. And now for our featured conversation, I'd like to introduce our Chief Executive Officer, Suzanne Nassel.
So, the Penn Charter, adopted in 1948, states that the necessary advance of the world toward a more highly organized political and economic order renders a free criticism of governments, administrations, and institutions imperative. And since freedom implies voluntary restraint, members of Penn pledge themselves to oppose such evils of a free press as mendacious publication, deliberate falsehood, and distortion of facts for political and personal ends. While the Penn Charter references the principle of voluntary restraint as something obvious, it is today an under-recognized enabler of civilization and human relations. None of us says everything that comes to mind, and for good reason. Words can spark hurts and ruptures. We make constant calculations of what to say and not to say to our spouses, children, coworkers, and Twitter followers. But voluntary restraint exists on a continuum. At the far end of the spectrum are the easy cases. We mostly refrain from insulting someone else's taste, looks, or cooking, at least in their presence. That speech is relatively unimportant, balanced against potential for real and immediate hurt. As you move along the spectrum, though, the calculation contorts. For writers whose lifeblood is words, speech carries special value. Artistic expression, a dissenting viewpoint, an uncomfortable revelation that unmasks truth. The trade-offs are multidimensional. The very same social media post can anoint you both hero and villain to different audiences. A writer has conflicting loyalties to readers, family, friends, tribes, peeps, and those who have revealed confidences. Moreover, of course, not all voluntary restraint is truly voluntary. It operates in an ecosystem of values, mores, pressures, and threats. The proper bounds of voluntary restraint have become a fulcrum of PEN America's recent work, whether on disinformation, online harassment, digital content moderation, or reconciling the imperatives of equity and inclusion with free speech on campus. We deal with speech that, while protected by the First Amendment, is probably better left unsaid. Bigotry, bullying, dissembling, divisiveness, conspiracy mongering, quackery, cruelty, and more. Yet, not infrequently, one person's notion of that which cannot be said is another's version of precisely that which must be said. But before we launch into a discussion of writers on self-censorship, a bit of context is needed. The greatest catalyst of self-censorship is not social pressure, but government dictate. We know that because of our work all over the world. While here in this country, we've long been able to rest on the assurances of the First Amendment, that safeguard's being sorely tested. PEN America has documented more than 54 educational gag order laws introduced in state houses across the country to curtail teaching and learning on issues of race. We've spent recent weeks working with school boards, librarians, and students across the country fighting against book bans. As a new chill of government-sponsored censorship takes root across the country, professors, teachers, and writers will unavoidably take heed of these new red lines and make conscious and even unconscious decisions about whether to challenge them, weighing up speech and consequences. Against that backdrop, our collective determination of where the limits of voluntary restraint ought to lie is crucial. And I can think of no better group of panelists to help us probe that question than this one. I want to introduce them quickly. I have, first off, John McWhorter, professor of linguistics at Columbia University, contributing newsletter writer at the New York Times, host of Slate's language podcast, Lexicon Valley. He's the author of over 20 books, the latest of which is Woke Racism, How a New Religion Has Betrayed Black America, published in October. Next up will be Jennifer Finney Boylan, best-selling author, activist, and columnist for the New York Times, PEN America trustee. Her 2003 memoir, She's Not There, A Life in Two Genders, was the first best-selling book by a transgender American. She's the inaugural Anna Quindlen Writer-in-Residence at Barnard College. Next, Wajahat Ali, author, playwright, and columnist for The Daily Beast, MSNBC, formerly New York Times. He's been involved with PEN America on the M-Word, our series on Muslim American voices, and his forthcoming book, Go Back to Where You Came From, and Other Helpful Recommendations on How to Become American, will be published in January. And then finally, we're waiting. Carmen Maria Machado, I think, is on her way after a delayed train from Philadelphia, but in motion, and will be here in a few minutes, and I'll introduce her now just to say she's a best-selling and award-winning author of fiction, essays, and criticism. She's been awarded the Bard Fiction Prize, the Lambda Literary Award for Lesbian Fiction, and the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Prize, among others. And we've been working with Carmen to combat a book ban in Leander, Texas, which includes her 2019 memoir, In the Dream House. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. Each of our panelists will speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a conversation among us, and then we'll bring in all of you and those who are online. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, John McWhorter.
Thank you, Suzanne. I imagine that I should talk into this. And I would say that in terms of our general topic of self-censorship, that I wouldn't say that we shouldn't have any. It is a mythical notion that we could ever have a society where everything was up for grabs. If we're human beings where we have what we would call intellectual development over time, if there's a such thing as intellectual and moral history, then of course there are going to be certain things that we don't discuss, if only for the simple reason that we have limited time. I don't see why we should talk about genocide as something that we might want to have a constructive discussion about, or whether some people should be denied the suffrage. But I would definitely say that to be a writer today, especially in the current climate, is to be someone who certainly probably censors themselves in some way, unless one is up for a certain kind of recreational and ceaseless abuse that I think few people are ready for. And I would just say that in terms of my own work, there's a dog that doesn't bark. I'm known as a contrarian on race issues. Apparently I get out of bed and I think, who am I going to annoy today by saying the wrong thing about black people? That's what I do every day. And so I'm often told, well, you're so brave. And I don't know if it's bravery as much as just being obsessive and wanting to see all the ducks in a row. But I do remember an experience that I had in what would have been 1995, October, the second week of October 1995. This is seared into my memory. I was asked to give a talk about, this is getting a bit into the weeds, but Creole languages like Haitian Creole and Jamaican Patois and Papiamentu. I was asked by a university to give a talk about women and those languages, which was a rather oblique topic in itself, but I said I'll do my best. And I said some things, none of which, and you have to trust me on this, there's a distance in time and I've got 5 minutes, but none of which most people would consider particularly interesting. I was just talking about issues with those languages that would have to do with women and also the women who have researched them. But there were some people in the audience who chose to interpret one thing I said as offensive, as sexist in some way. And I remember that day, this is like the middle of the Clinton administration, I was an assistant professor, and I was looking at the cold eyes of the audience and listening to some of the things people said. And I thought, I don't deserve this. And I realized, reason won't work here. And that day I decided I will never again say or write anything about issues having to do with women or sexism. I think my heart is in the right place, but this must never happen to me again. It's one thing to be a contrarian about race, but I cannot have 51% of humanity hating me for no reason. And I haven't since. And so if somebody went through my work, they would see that I skirt saying anything about women or sexism at all. And I'm going to stick to it. That is a certain kind of self-censorship because I'm not brave about that. Or I would certainly say that as a human being, some things, of course, disgust me. Some things make me angry. Jennifer and I were talking about this just now. I can't write about those things because I'm a contrarian and I have a stuffy voice. I noticed early on, if I write about something that disgusts me, it's considered unpleasant, it's considered elitist, it's considered, as we say these days, not a good look. Whereas somebody from a different political aspect of the spectrum is allowed to write with disgust, and that's considered speaking truth to power. But I censor disgust. I try to keep an even keel, and I always feel a little bit dishonest. It's not that I'm somebody who walks around spewing disgust all the time, but that is an aspect of me that I cannot put into my writing. Instead, I put it into my socializing and my dreams, which is not the same thing. And so that is my feeling about the notion of self-censorship in our current climate. It forces a certain kind of mendacity and artifice, which I regret at times. Life isn't perfect, but we do live in a climate. That's what I would say about that.
Carmen, welcome.
Hello, hello. Hi, everybody. So I'm over here at the podium. I hope you'll forgive me. I wrote my thoughts out so I wouldn't forget them, and I don't want to read them sitting down. It seems weird. So I'm going to read them standing up. And before I get started, can I just thank you for being here on behalf of the trustees and from PEN America. The fact that you're here means so much to us, and we're grateful for all the support that you give PEN. And I'm also personally very grateful to Suzanne and to Ayad for their remarkable leadership. So, yeah, self-censorship. What do you think of this? In 1983, Steve Martin starred in a movie titled The Man with Two Brains, a story about a man who falls in love with a brain in a jar. Eventually, his wife is murdered by a serial killer played by Merv Griffin, and when all is said and done, the brain that he has a crush on is transplanted into the body of his dead wife, and the two of them live happily ever after, except for the fact that Merv Griffin remains at large to continue his diabolical reign of terror. It's a traditional story, you know, boy meets brain, boy loses brain. You know. I was thinking about that film recently because of a conversation we had at one of our PEN trustees meetings, a conversation in which the person who wound up having two brains was me. The topic under discussion was whether artists have the right to create work that is considerably outside their own lived experiences. So, for instance, do white writers have the right to write from the point of view of black characters, or do cis actors have the right to play transgender parts in film? It's a conversation that you're all probably familiar with by now, and it was, among other things, the heart of the blowback against the novel American Dirt last year, a book about the lives of imaginary Mexican immigrants written by a woman who identified, at least until 2016, as white. I'm sure most PEN members remember the controversy, even if, like me, they did not actually read that particular book, because the question just strikes really close to our hearts. Surely, if freedom of expression means anything, it means the right to tell the stories we want to tell, to answer the demands of our own imaginations, period. You can accuse writers of not writing well, or of creating characters that don't seem real, or plots that stretch credulity, but surely the business of erasing artists because we do not like their art is despicable. And in the end, if we know only one thing, it's this, that we stand in defense of the imagination, no matter how strange or unsettling or controversial that imagination might be. That's what artists do. We imagine possibilities. Okay, so that there would be the first brain. Here's another thing I believe, and I believe it with the same passion with which I believe in the freedom to create. Artists, which includes probably everybody in this room, I suspect, are responsible for their work. That probably sounds uncontroversial, but I think a lot of writers, having completed a story or a novel or a screenplay, then decide that, you know, our work done, We are geniuses, and anyone who has a problem with the work we've made is simply jealous or small-minded or incapable of comprehending our idiosyncratic brilliance. It's like the scene, did you see the movie Castaway with Tom Hanks? And there's that scene where he builds the fire and he stands, he's on this deserted island and he builds a fire. And afterwards, after building the fire, he struts around the flames shouting, "Yes, I have made fire! With these hands, I have made fire!" And so on. I admit that I have spoken a lot like that sometimes after I've written something I'm particularly proud of. I read my own book, and writers, you know, when it's, and some of you say, "Oh no, I never read my work after." No, come on. Just kind of sneak, like you have the actual book, you kind of sit down, and you think, yeah, okay. So I read my book, or I see a column of mine in the newspaper, and I think, yes, it's true. I am a genius. I have made fire. Thank you. But the thing is, sometimes maybe we get it wrong. Many Mexican writers and immigrants praised American Dirt, but there were plenty of others who said the author got things that was a little off, or to pick an example a little closer to home, at least for me, the film Dallas Buyers Club had a transgender character in it played by Jared Leto. And when that movie came out, people fell all over themselves talking about how great the film was and how wonderful it was that a trans character had been presented with such insight and compassion. Jared Leto was nominated for, and in fact won, Best Supporting Actor that year in a moment that a lot of people felt was a big step forward for diversity and trans representation. About the only people who felt that that film got things wrong, in fact, were, you know, transgender people. There was no shortage of trans writers and critics who spent a lot of time that year saying, actually, that's not really it. That's not what our lives are like. I know you all tried hard and that you meant well, but in spite of all that, you got our stories wrong. And that the story that, in fact, you actually told is kind of insulting. But they gave Jared Leto the Academy Award anyway. Many of us had similar things to say about The Danish Girl, a film that, even correcting for history, still doesn't quite ring true, at least not to my ears. Y'all nominated Eddie Redmayne for an Oscar for that one, too. So this is the problem for my second brain, because I hate it when artists get things wrong. Maybe a single movie or a book doesn't matter that much if someone gets it right or wrong. But if you think that defending freedom of expression is really all that important, then I think we have to feel it does matter, because a single movie or a book or a film can really shape the way people see the world, especially when they're forming an impression of people, like, say, transgender people, whom they haven't really encountered in the world, or they think they haven't encountered in the world. So that's my story of two brains, which sounds a little bit like a horror movie, I guess, or maybe a comedy. I also think of that Joni Mitchell song, the one that ends, "And you know two heads are better than one." Because if you ask me, it's perfectly possible to hold both of these ideas in your head at the same time. We can defend the right of artists and writers to create exactly what they feel in their souls. That is, of course, at the heart of so much of our work at PEN America. But we can also hold artists responsible for the work they create. Being asked to take a hard look at whether or not you've got your story right is not the same as cancellation or censorship. What it is the hope that when you make art or when you tell a story, that the story you're telling is true. And by true, I don't necessarily mean realistic, because we all know that even when a story takes place, say, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, that story can still be true artistically. Sometimes, in fact, there can be more truth in fiction than in nonfiction. I want to just end this short talk by sharing one more story with you that kind of sums up my feelings on this topic. This is the absolutely true story of this is great, I love this title, The Lion of Gripsholm Castle. You have to admit, that's a good name for a story, right? Okay, so here's the story. In 1730, the King of Sweden was given a lion as a present. I don't know where the lion came from, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't Sweden. In any case, when the lion died, it was given to a group of taxidermists to be stuffed and preserved and kept in Gripsholm Castle, where the king lived. I guess he wanted to look at the stuffed lion and say things like, yeah, back in the day, I had a lion. That was awesome. Now, let's agree that these taxidermists were talented artists and that they were probably among the best taxidermists in all of Sweden, being in the service, after all, of the king, and that these artists had the freedom to practice their craft and that no one should ever have been in the business of canceling them or telling them what they could or could not create. But here's the deal. When all was said and done and they presented their work to the king, this is what they came up with. Ladies and gentlemen, the Lion of Gripsholm Castle. There he is. So, what went wrong here? The artists were good at their job. They practiced their craft as best they could. There's only one problem. None of them had actually ever seen a lion before, so they had no idea what one was supposed to look like. I can tell you I've seen a lot of films and read a lot of books about transgender people written by people who had no idea what a life like mine is actually like. I'm not arguing for censorship or cancellation or putting any fetters of any kind on the freedom to create. In the end, my first brain wants you to know artists have to be free to invent, to speak, and to create, and anyone who would interfere with that process can go straight to hell. My second brain just wants to add one thing, though. That's not a lion. Thank you.
I don't have a slide with a lion, so thank you, Jenny. Good evening, and thank you for inviting me with such august company to discuss this heartwarming topic about self-censorship and threats to our freedom of speech during a time when the majority of Republican voters in this country believe the big lie and thousands of people tried to overtake the U.S. Capitol to cancel a free and fair election. Awesome. This is going to be fun. This is going to be like this for the next 5 minutes, though, all right? First, I want everyone to know that John McWhorter was my professor when I was a freshman at UC Berkeley in 1998. So everyone thinks I'm older than him, but he was my professor. All right. Secondly, I would like to thank Jenny for basically being a huge nerd, because when we had our pre-call conference, right, we were like, oh, what are you going to do? We're like, me and Carmen were like, we'll just sit and, take the microphone and talk. And Jenny's like, well, I have a prepared remark with slides. And then me and Carmen were like, F our lives, fine. We'll have to prepare some remarks as well. So this is me trying my best as I wrote this on the Amtrak from Virginia. Thank you, Carmen, for being here as well. And I was supposed to basically, if you don't know, I was supposed to basically bide the time before you made this dramatic exit. And also I'd like to thank Ayad, my Pakistani brother from another mother, for not tucking in his shirt and not wearing a tie. And yes, we are the same person. He's the one without hair, I'm the one with hair. Here we are. It's been exciting to be a moderate Muslim during the endless war on terror. We moderates are apparently an endangered species, brown and black unicorns. You can call me a brownicorn. The invisible cola of Muslims, the refugees from Agrabah, which in 2015, 30% of Republican voters wanted to bomb, even though it is a fictional kingdom in the movie Aladdin. Can't make this stuff up. God bless America. We are perpetually asked to condemn violent acts done by violent extremists we've never met and forever seen as potential suspects whose loyalty is always questioned by a country that sees us as threats, not neighbors, and seems to turn on us on a dime and tells us to go back to where we came from. For me, that would be Fremont, California, which we're told that our countries are shithole countries, not shithouse countries, because apparently shithouse countries have Wi-Fi. Where are the moderate Muslims was the question asked of nearly every single Muslim organization, religious leader, imam, and writer who had an access to a mainstream platform after 9/11. Where are you, and how come you haven't condemned extremism? Even though we did, always, it never mattered. Even though we did not commit the 9/11 terror attacks, which were done by 19 foreign hijackers, 15 from Saudi Arabia, 2 from UAE, 1 from Lebanon, 1 from Egypt. Again, my family is from Pakistan. None of those countries. But it doesn't matter, because I was born and raised in the Bay Area, America, to Pakistani immigrant parents, but I was Muslim. And nuances don't matter because after 9/11, Islam was at war with the West. And I've spent 20 years trying to find Islam and 20 years trying to find the West, and I've not had a date with either of them. I was also told it was us versus them, a clash of civilizations, and anyone who looked Muslimi was a suspect, such as Balbir Singh, the first victim of a hate crime a few days after 9/11, who was shot and killed by a white supremacist because he brought down the towers. He was a Sikh American, brown and bearded, a gas station owner in Mesa, Arizona. Bigots aren't nuanced. When 9/11 happened, I was a 20-year-old senior, undeclared, at UC Berkeley, and a member of the Muslim Student Association. And overnight, I thought, why didn't I join the Indian Student Association? F my life. I could have learned Bhangra and learned good spelling, but now I'm a member of the Muslim Student Association, where I overnight had to be the representative of 1.7 billion people and 1,400 years of Islamic civilization. And on the drop of a dime, I had to be an expert on Islam, Quran, Sharia, Prophet Muhammad, Hamas, Hamas, and everything in between. And if I made a mistake, not only would I be personally held liable, but all things Muslimi will be held liable because we were not allowed to make mistakes. We are not allowed to fail up. We would immediately be canceled. We always had to be moderate and condemn violent acts done by violent people we've never met in violent countries we've never visited. And if we didn't condemn hard enough, well, your loyalty would be always held as suspect by a nameless judge, jury, and executioner. It was interesting. God forbid if you sent the wrong tweet, right? You and your people collectively don't get a pass or the benefit of the doubt. You don't get to fail up and whine endlessly about cancel culture from some of the most prestigious outlets, such as Andrew Sullivan. Too soon? Too soon? Or not soon enough? God forbid, don't be Muslim and say anything critical about Israel. That's what was our fear of self-censorship in 2000, 2001 during the Second Intifada, where these brown kids, nerds, used to drink chai, watch TV, and we used to just protest, and the most dangerous thing was wear a misplaced keffiyeh. But at that time, knowing if you were brown and Muslim in 2000, 2001, if you said something against Israel, against the occupation, we were placed on something called Campus Watch. And at that time, as 20-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 21-year-olds, we realized that we would be called anti-Semites, and that would be held as a noose around our neck for the rest of our lives. Case in point, my friend, who is now Rima Dodin, one of the highest-ranking Muslims in the White House, who works in the Biden administration, one day came to me on Sproul Hall, almost crying, saying, "Honey, I just gave an interview, and oh my God, I think they misinterpreted me, and they're going to quote me, and this is going to haunt me for the rest of my life." 20 years old. That article did come out. She said something about suicide bombers. They misinterpreted her. Rima Dodin is the most beloved person in Congress, loved bipartisan by both sides. When her nomination came up last year, this attack from 20 years ago that she had dreaded for 20 years came to almost smear her, and thankfully allies came up and saved her. Imagine that, having something hang over you for 20 years, and at that time realizing this might destroy my career. All right? We were also not invited to be the protagonist of the American narrative. We were depicted as terrorists, wannabe terrorists, family members of terrorists, potential terrorists, or cab drivers driving terrorists. Eventually, we evolved. Give me a minute, I'll be done in a minute. We were the one good Muslim in 24 in Homeland, and our only narrative was how we helped advance national security. That was the good Muslim. And I always tried to fight back. I became a playwright. I wrote a play, and when that play came out, I remember I was told that the mainstream would not like an ethnic story. I was told by my own community, censor all the political stuff out. When I got on CNN, I was introduced just 3 years ago as the Muslim journalist. And I'm like, I'm a Muslim journalist? Interesting. No one said, here's the Jew and here's the Catholic, but I was the Muslim journalist. As a writer, I was told you can only write about Muslim stories, but never about economics or politics, right? And you have to self-censor yourself because you realize oftentimes in the landscape that you're in that the gatekeepers and editors do not look like you. You do not have mentors. You're not allowed to be angry as a president is talking about a Muslim ban. You're not allowed righteous rage because only some people with the right complexion are allowed to be angry in this country. And so here we are in this environment where we self-censor ourselves, but I cannot complain because I'm a privileged writer speaking to an august company at PEN America, And I have been attacked both by the outside and by the inside in our communities. We could talk about that later. For being a sellout, John gets it also. I think Jenny gets it as well. But I don't whine too much, because as I'm sitting here and ending this little spiel and TED Talk, Texas library just banned 400 books. And a Texas lawmaker introduced 850 books that he wants to ban, predominantly, surprise, surprise, by writers of color, transgender writers. And in Florida today, a report came out that researchers and faculty members at the University of Florida are self-censoring themselves, literally removing race-related courses and taking away COVID data because they are afraid of backlash from DeSantis. And people are trying to suppress votes, and people are trying to cancel elections. So as we complain about cancel culture and the youth and the liberals, let us take stock of what's really happening and who are the forces who are really attacking our freedom of speech in the United States of America. Thank you for your time.
Hello, everybody. Jenny, thank you for making us do the podium. I think it was the right choice. I feel good being up here. I feel like I'm gonna be having I feel like we have Jenny and I are having almost like a sister conversation or like a cousin conversation. I wanted to talk a little bit about the thing that is worrying me, which is I feel like is how I know I'm getting older, because I'm just there are things that worry me about the world. I am not sure anything in the sort of the realm of my professional career has worried me more in the past 2 years than this very specific conversation around the ethics of fiction writing, something that someone suggested to me might be called a fictional trespass. There are two discussions in particular that really shaped my concern. I hate to use the word discourse, but I need to. The discourse surrounding the so-called real subject of Kristen Rupenian's Cat Person and the bad art friend conversation, in which it is suggested, among other things, that it is unethical for a writer to write about a real-life figure that they know into a short story. There's a very particular word that has sort of floated around these conversations, and that word is theft. I'm not precisely talking about cultural appropriation, sort of the way Jenny was, but it is sort of, again, like a kind of a cousin conversation, though many people made that connection when this conversation was happening. It was something closer to the idea that there's theft of someone's life, the idea that details of your life or existence are first singular and unique, and also fundamentally owned and only permitted to be shaped by the owner, and therefore can be taken without consent. Many people who write nonfiction weighed in on this conversation, assuming perhaps that the ethics between their practice and fiction are the same, not realizing that fiction is actually 10,000% its own animal. Fiction is a patchwork of invention and, let's call it, borrowing, and that fact is a feature, not a bug. It is the fundamental nature of the thing, a patchwork that assures that something true or strange or singular is being brought to us. This is hardly a new idea. It's how fiction has been written for literally all of its own history. I am profoundly concerned with the implications of the conversation, that ethical fiction, or fiction properly created, requires only the most literal harvesting of the self or complete wholesale invention, that the process of using other details from history, from life, from other people, from research is somehow lazy or a shirking of one's responsibility, when in fact it is the core of the fiction writer's responsibility, writing toward truth, or if you like, an expansion of human consciousness by any means necessary. Last year, Otessa Moshfegh wrote, quote, and this is a very long quote, so I apologize, I wish that future novelists would reject the pressure to write for the betterment of society. Art is not media. A novel is not an afternoon special or fodder for the Twittersphere or material for journalists to make neat generalizations about culture. A novel is not BuzzFeed or NPR or Instagram or even Hollywood. Let's get clear about that. A novel is a literary work of art meant to expand human consciousness. We need novels that live in an amoral universe, past the political agenda described on social media. We have imaginations for a reason. Novels like American Psycho and Lolita did not poison culture, murderous corporations and exploitative industries did. We need characters in novels to be free to range into the dark and wrong. How else will we understand ourselves? That's the end of the quote. In her essay, John Updike, His Stories and Me, the poet Molly Fisk discussed the precise thing that this practice can provide us. In the essay, she writes about the fact that family friend, John Updike, wrote a story for The New Yorker which both borrowed details from her late father's life and invented some salacious ones of his own, including making the character, based on her father, a producer of pornography. Molly writes about how she and her family were blindsided and devastated by the perceived theft and simultaneous slander of her father. Only when Molly was older did she come to realize, or come to the reality, that her father had molested her as a child. When she talked to Updike about this before her death, he recalled a stray moment in which he saw her father use oddly sexual language toward his daughter, a thread which eventually developed into the story in question. This is, of course, all a fiction writer needs, a strange moment, a detail that catches like a sweater on a nail. Fiction writers are by nature magpies. We accumulate details until they accumulate story and meaning. John Updike had arrived on some variation of the truth through his own writerly perception. He didn't ask for consent or consult the relevant parties. He did that weird thing that fiction writers do that is so hard to explain to anyone who isn't, and in doing so, he arrived at something realer than the subject himself would have ever allowed. This is the important part. This is what matters. After the conversation about Cat Person and Bad Art Friend, I remember paging through my own short story collection and trying to identify the things that I had picked up from other people. There were so many, even more than I had remembered. A girl that I'd been in Girl Scouts with as a kid had sleepwalked into the woods on one of our camping trips. That detail appears in The Resident. An early version of 8 Bites could have been described as being from my point of view or something like it, but the story did not come alive until I inverted the gaze, wrote the story from the perspective of someone like my mother, borrowing large swaths of reality and cutting it with ghosts. Did I steal my mother's story? What about that girl I went to Girl Scouts with? Maybe, sure. Does it matter? Does it matter when the story comes alive on the page? I am worried that fiction writers, especially those experiencing formative development here and now in the moment of these conversations, will find themselves stymied and self-censored by the most natural of impulses. I guess what I want to say is, novels are not corporations, fiction writers are not burglars, fiction is not nonfiction. The creation of fiction is a fundamentally amoral exercise. We are not good for inventing or bad for borrowing. Thank you.
Terrific. Okay, thank you all so much. To begin with, I want to ask one question. I want to ask you to try to keep your answers fairly brief, just because I have a lot I want to get to, and I also want to get to our audience both in the room and online. But one question I have that sort of threads through what each of you has said is, to the degree that we're talking about a phenomenon that seems to be arising or intensifying now, or in the last couple of years, my question is, what has changed? Is it sort of the boundary line of what is considered permissible or transgressive or trespassing in the case of Carmen, or to John's realm, that which is considered a view about women that's now considered unacceptable that you could have voiced a decade or two ago? Is it that boundary line of what is objectionable or offensive, or is it just the reaction and sort of the means at people's disposal to create a sense of reprisal and stigmatization that is inhibiting? Or have both of those changed? We know the latter has changed, for one thing because of social media, but has the actual sort of positioning of that boundary line of that which is acceptable also shifted, and in what way?
It starts in 2009, because that was the year, no one thought about it at the time, but that was the year that Twitter really took off, and that was the year that people started asking, oh, you're not on Facebook? That happened in 2009. Facebook became default that year. Then, I think something really has happened over the past couple years, although I don't know if we've been necessarily talking about that. And it was based on two very mundane things. Social history is always highly contingent. First, the hideousness of what happened to George Floyd was very galvanizing. Second, and this is hard to talk about, but that happened when everybody was stuck at home, bored and lonely, and it was spring. And so there was a time when people had a natural desire to coalesce around certain common concerns, possibly to go outside, but more to the point, people wished to belong to one another because of that condition. I really think we would not be having this conversation if there had not been a pandemic starting in March 2020. So in May 2020, a certain ideology used social media to become especially dominant and scared a lot of people out of their wits, and we're still orienting ourselves towards what to do about it now. If it hadn't been for George Floyd and the pandemic, we would be having a 2019 kind of conversation, I believe.
When you asked that question, Suzanne, one of my first thoughts was something like, you say self-censorship like it's a bad thing. Which, I mean, we don't believe in censorship, but by another name, do we call self-censorship what? A sense of awareness that our words affect other people, and that, you know, you can't and maybe shouldn't say any damn thing you want. And sometimes self-censorship means thinking twice about what comes out of your mouth. And maybe that's a good thing. But there's a difference between that on the one hand, and then if we talk about Twitter and that world, I can tell you that there have been plenty of times when I have not said what I feel, and not because I'm trying to be polite, but because I'm afraid that the things I really do believe are going to land me in a world of trouble. And I think one of the reasons I became a writer, I mean, yes, of course, to observe truth and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated, what is it, the uncreated truth of my race or something? Sorry, James Joyce, wherever you are. But another reason I became a writer is because I wanted people to like me.
That's why you became a writer?
Dubious.
Well, yeah, maybe that was not necessarily good motivation. But I thought that creating art, maybe there's something in me, you know, the teenager is like, well, people will read this thing I wrote and think, wow, she's really funny, or she's really smart. And so you combine that with just being transgender in the first place, and I feel like I've wound up this fairly vulnerable, battered person who is just so tired of being punched around, mostly figuratively. I mean, mostly symbolically, but not always only symbolically. That I just can't offer myself up for these. For things that I know, you know, that I'm going to spend I'll have to get offline for the next 2 weeks because I just can't take it, because I want so much on some level to be liked by a bunch of assholes. Maybe, yeah, I mean, maybe I'll let my voice fall there. All done.
You're not assholes, she was saying. This is the other assholes. The election of my Muslim brother, Barack Hussein Obama, in 2008, which shattered so many people who could not believe that they were witnessing a black family ascend to the White House and replace the 43 previous white men who had come before. It jump-started the Tea Party, jump-started the mainstreaming of what was considered white supremacist fringe narratives, but is now mainstream, like the replacement theory, which you can hear every night on Tucker Carlson's show, which came from the KKK and the Nazis, which says the Jews are part of a cabal. They're the nerve center using black and brown folks, feminists, Hollywood, and LGBT to weaken and replace Western civilization. West is synonymous with white. And then you see also the rise of social media, for better and worse, where people who were once marginalized now have access to enter the conversation, but then also some nutty people and some Russian trolls have access to enter the conversation, and we are confronted oftentimes with brutality that many black and brown people have faced, such as the murder of George Floyd, where we see the video, or the murder of the lynching of Ahmaud Arbery, right? And so in the past 12, 15 years, what's been happening, I think, is power is really resistant to giving up some of that power. And the 10 board members who used to be white now have to contend that there's a woman and a black person and a Muslim and someone who's transgender. And power, as you guys have often heard this offset quote, is often blind to its own privileges and how it abuses those privileges. And equality is oppression to those who are in power. And so we're having this type of disruption moment in America, this reclamation project with white supremacy, where people are literally fighting for the soul of the nation. Some people want us to drag us back to 1953, before Brown versus Board of Education. And some people want to expand this country to include the rest of us who oftentimes have had to self-censor ourselves or have our voices and narratives snuffed out. It's messy. And that's what you're seeing right now, this messiness. And this messiness is compounded by social media, I think, which we can all agree, sometimes essentializes and flattens us to our one trait, even though we're a complex human. So then John just becomes his last op-ed. And I have to hate him, and he has to hate me because I disagree with his concept of wokeness. And then we have to fight to the death, apparently. And then you guys say a thumbs up or thumbs down.
So just speaking to my sort of concerns in particular, I think I feel like now that I'm like Twitter, I'm like, oh, that is, okay, all right, that's just where I am in my life. I mean, I think that social media over COVID, I think we lost the thread. I think that there was something really particular that happened where a lot of people were just like trapped in their homes and just like spending way more time than normal on social media. And, you know, the conversations that were happening, I think these like concentrated, hyper fast sort of like conversations in which sort of the point ends up getting kind of shot past in this really dramatic way. And we end up with like conspiracy theories and these sort of like weird obsessive spirals that also just have these various sort of like, this person is good, this person is bad sort of outcomes. I mean, I feel like it's like social media is bad, and I think social media over COVID is just worse, you know, and I feel like it really accelerated. Like, it's not lost on me that like all the sort of versions of this that I've seen have been over the past 2 years specifically. And it's also not lost on me. I mean, I don't exactly know how to connect this, but it's like not lost on me that like Twitter, which is like this massive corporation that is like actively making the world worse, is also contributing to this like degradation of like the conversation around art and like fiction and like the nature of fiction and the creation of fiction. I mean, it's just like a weird side effect, I guess. But it feels like particularly dangerous, which I feel like complaining about Twitter is like the weirdest thing I could possibly be doing. But like I do actively, I mean, I feel like in the way that it's making the world worse, I actually feel like social media, the sort of this flattening effect that happens really does create these just incredibly fast, bad conversations that just go sideways so quickly that there's just no recovering from it. Yeah.
I want to go to this question. I mean, Jenny, you touched on it, and I brought it up in my introduction, which is this continuum between what the Penn Charter called sort of, quite innocently, voluntary restraint, and just the discretion that we all exercise for so many reasons. I mean, even in fiction, there's some line of depicting a real person or a close friend or a family member that I'm sure fiction writers would have respected for a long time, or they'd fictionalize sufficiently so that the details were blurred and they wouldn't put somebody, in an uncomfortable spotlight. And with offenses, be it about, discussion of sexism or transgender individuals, there's a certain level of voluntary restraint that we all would agree is appropriate, necessary, internalized. We carry it out in our own lives and work. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's this, heavy, repressive, suffocating feeling of censoriousness that's voluntary. It's not the state telling you what you can and can't write, but it's this sense you have from, these dramas that have played out that, you may be in big trouble if you if you trespass, if you traverse certain lines. And what I'd love for each of you to reflect on is, where is that boundary line? I mean, what is that? Where does it cross over into a pernicious self-censorship? How do we encapsulate, that version of discretion that is excessive, that draws something away from our collective discourse, to borrow your word, that detracts from open debate, from creative freedom, and that, ultimately is that which, as defenders of free expression, we ought to try to resist. How do we draw that line?
Well, I think if you feel yourself pulling back on the reins of your own imagination, maybe you have to ask yourself, am I doing this out of cowardice or am I doing this out of wisdom? Because there are times when I have not said certain things in public ways or written certain things because I have been afraid that I'm going to get yelled at for this, and there are times when it has to be said anyway. I mean, in some ways, to be a transgender person, and even more so 20 years ago when I came out, to allow as how you were human was a controversial thing to say. At least it felt that way to me. So sometimes it takes courage to say the thing that you know is going to be unpopular. Other times, I think you have to wonder if you're pulling back on the reins, maybe it's a good thing. Maybe that's discretion. Maybe that's respect for knowing that maybe you need to do more research about the thing you're writing, and that your own genius is not the only thing that justifies your creation. Your supposed genius.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm so interested in this conversation. There's something that I know I had mentioned it in our pre-call and then I didn't come up in this talk, but I do want to talk about it. So I feel like what's so interesting about this question of the line is that we don't know where the line is. Like, the line is sort of this moving thing, and when somebody has self-censored, we don't know, right? We might know if someone tells us, but we have no way of knowing what has not been born, what does not exist in the world. And then occasionally we get these things that show us really clearly what this looks like. So there is another conversation, which I did not mention, that was very serious to me that happened last year. It was actually right before COVID. There was this writer, and the story didn't quite get didn't get a lot of traction in sort of the literary world, but I'm also very plugged into the genre fiction world, and it was happening sort of in the sci-fi fantasy world. There was a writer, a trans writer, who wrote this short story called "I Sexually Identify as an Attack Helicopter," which is a transphobic meme that has existed on the internet for a very long time. And she took this transphobic meme and wrote this beautiful, devastating science fictional story, which literalizes the metaphor and imagines this person whose gender is attack helicopter, and sort of this, and talks about gender dysphoria, and talks about all these sort of different elements, and also sort of kind of anticipates this thing that's happening now, which is the militarization. So this is sort of the military industrial complex kind of co-opting sort of language about progressive language about gender and sexuality in a way of sort of bringing in queer people to this sort of neoliberal agenda, right? And so she did this all in 5,000 words, and it was incredible. And unfortunately, she made the mistake of doing it under a name that didn't have any sort of previous writing associated with it. It was her first time writing under her name. And some people did not like the way the story talked about sort of gender politics and thought that it was bad. And within 3 days of the story coming out, people were saying, oh, her bio has her birthday as being in 1988. That's a code. She's obviously a Nazi or a white supremacist. She's definitely not trans. It's definitely like a white cisgender man who has military experience. Like, people were just like throwing out all these conspiracy theories saying like, there's no way a trans person would have written this story. Therefore, this story is bad. And a couple of things happened. One, the writer withdrew the story from the magazine. The story is no longer, you can find it in kind of little archives online, but it's no longer at the magazine. The author also has since written, there was an article written about it earlier this year, like talked about how she like stopped the process of transitioning. Like, she was so sort of devastated by this conversation that she just like kind of, or it arrested like everything that was sort of going on. And so the fact that people were like, there's no way, because this is like the other side of this conversation, right? Which is like, they're like, well, we don't know the author's trans. There's no way a trans person would have written this story. Therefore, the story is bad and it's suspect, right? And so you could actually see, because it was a story that like got born and then kind of like got sucked back in, right? And so you can actually see like what that process sort of is looking like. And it's this horrible example of like what that can, like what you can see. But then the other sort of side of it is like, I just kept thinking about all of the queer writing that like wasn't getting born because people were so freaked out by the idea that like a bunch of strangers would be policing their gender identity on Twitter and like are gonna say that they are, you know, creating transphobic art because it's not the right kind of trans narrative. Of course, this applies to all, you know, it could be not the right, you know, narrative, you know, not the right female narrative or like black narrative or whatever. Let's obsession with like there's one kind of story. So yeah, so I just feel like that's what's so, I feel like this is what I mean is like, I understand this idea of like, you know, wisdom and restraint and like being like, not every story is mine to tell, but I also feel like it feels so weird to create blanket statements about like who can do what, because then I feel like what you end up with is this like sort of opposite problem. Yeah.
Suzanne keeps looking at me like I talk too much, so I'm so worried. I'm going to look just at the clock. I'm going to stop talking exactly when it hits 8:21. Very quick, I think some thoughts should stay in our head. I think most of us would benefit more from listening, right? I don't know if that's self-censorship or us adapting to a changing landscape where we're learning that there's transgender people and they appreciate being referred to their pronoun. You're learning and you want to be a good human being and a good citizen. You don't want to be an asshole. And maybe I don't have to say this slur anymore. Versus, am I self-censoring myself for fear, right? And is progress and creative ideas and stories that should be out there, no matter how messy and imperfect, should we be able to tolerate the messiness for the sake of creation, right? And I think you said something which was very nice about courage and wisdom is your barometer. I would also say self-preservation. I'm at 8:21. I have to stop. I gave myself. I'll finish in 20 seconds.
Don't let me censor you all.
Courage. You said wisdom, and I will also add self-preservation. Because what I mean by self-preservation is for many writers, especially women on social media, and especially trans people, and I would also add black and brown folks, they're like, it's just not worth it. This hate's just not worth it. And they silence themselves. I don't want to go through this crap. I cannot tell you how many brilliant men and women who you think, you guys know them, they'd have to detox on WhatsApp or Signal. They're like the type of crap I get every day. And so for me, the test is, if I have the courage of my convictions, and I believe in this, even though it's an unpopular opinion, am I not saying it out of cowardice? Or am I not saying it because I'm going to get attacked by some folks? And then for me, it's the wisdom. Is it wise for me to say this and enter the fray? And then for me also it is, am I willing to go through the crap for the next 2 weeks and all the hate mail? And it's messy.
I'm a little outclassed here because I'm not really an artist, but I understand everything that you're saying. And I would agree with the idea that where you feel like you're operating out of fear, it's not that you feel like it wouldn't be wise to say something, but you're afraid to say it, and you're not sure you would agree with the grounds upon which you would be condemned, but you really have better things to do. It means that there's something wrong. And the only thing that I can think of is that in terms of fiction, because now and then I dip into a little bit of autobiography in my editorials, I'm often asked whether I would want to write some sort of fiction. People tell me that I could do it. I've never thought about it. I don't know if I would be good at it. It's not something I think about. But I know what people mean. I am capable of telling a story. And sometimes I think, wouldn't it be interesting to, instead of writing another polemic, to create some sort of story. And I must admit that I'm petrified to do it because I get the feeling people who say they want me to write a story want me to write a story essentially about myself. They want me to write a story about a rather saturnine, middle-aged black guy who grew up in the 70s in post-civil rights America. We would change Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. We would change my parents' names. I'm not a linguist. I'm a biologist. And, you know, I drift into a career writing for the media, and I'm so tender and confused about what it's like being a black man in a post-civil rights world. I don't want to write that novel. I wouldn't want to read it. If I wrote a novel, it would have nothing to do with me. My parents would not be in it. I would sit and take the world and churn it in my head and create all these people nobody had ever heard of. Some of them would be black, probably most of them wouldn't, and I would just make something up. It would not be about me at all. I don't care about me. And yet, I'm afraid that if I wrote that book, I would get in trouble because, of course, the people I made up would not be versions of me and my parents and my friends. It would be people I knew, teachers I knew, etc., and that would be considered appropriation in some way. And I must admit, I have other things to do. I'm not going to write a story about Jim McWhorter, but then on the other hand, if I write about anything else, in today's climate, I'm stealing. And so I guess I'm just going to keep writing polemics.
All right, I'm just going to do a time check, and I want someone from Penn to tell me if this is no good. But I'd like to ask one more question, and then I want to open it up, even though I know that's taking more time than we said. But I feel like we took a few minutes to get going, and I want to give people a chance. The last thing I want to ask is, you know, one thing I worry about in this vein, and it really has to do with our work around the world, is are the ways in which these strictures affect not just what you actually write and put out there, but what you begin to even think and consider, and how we internalize these constraints. You know, in China, for example, where they have such a robust system of censorship, I don't know that there are that many people who sort of think to themselves, gosh, I'd really like to write, you know, X, Y, and Z about Taiwan or Tiananmen Square or feminism or being LGBT, because the intensity of the taboos is so forceful that it's sort of, after a while, it doesn't really occur to you. And it kind of drains out of the society. And those impulses, you know, there are few people who do it, and we work with those writers, but the penalties are so stiff. You sacrifice everything, your freedom, your career, the safety of your family, that it's just a natural logic that those topics and subjects just fall away from a lot of discussion. And I wonder how you think that operates here. I mean, Carmen, you sort of hinted at it in the story of this one individual and what they had to retract. But are there entire subject areas and possibilities that are being retracted from our discourse as a whole because of these forces? And what do you worry that we might be losing? Go ahead.
Oh, is it? Yeah, you all did look at me. I don't know why. Okay. I mean, I feel like specifically, like, what I'm talking about is not so much subject matter as like a mode of creation. Like, it's like the process of fiction, of the creation of fiction, which is like, I guess, a slightly different thing. But I also feel like the process of being a fiction writer and having that like magpie quality that is like picking little bits and things here and there and like generating something new is, I mean, it's like a habit you have to develop. I mean, it's literally like I teach fiction at like the undergrad level, and like literally what I'm teaching my students to do is to like pay the fuck attention to what's going on around you, and like, you know, take from, like, literally I give them assignments where it's like, I want you to make 100 observations like in your daily life, like the people around you, the things you see. Like, this is literally what it is it's like keeping your eyes open, paying attention. That is like a skill that fiction writers possess that is very specific and like is what makes a good fiction writer good, or one of the things that makes them good. And so I think the idea that like to make the very nature of the thing that can make a fiction writer good taboo, or like making it, like giving it this stigma, is just so
sorry, I've just been yelling about this in my house for like months. Like it's just so beyond the pale. It's so shocking to me that like this. So yeah, I guess I do worry that like somebody would think could like take away from these conversations like I should never write a fictional version of anything that I've observed in this world that doesn't directly involve me. Like that feels like a very concerning thing, even if that, whether it's happening on a conscious level where somebody is, you know, having that thought actively, or it's just like they begin to not be paying attention in the way they should. So
I think I'm interested by the way commerce plays into elements of self-censorship, which is to say, I mean, that I'm happy and I love to write what my imagination demands, but I also want readers. And once you enter into this, once you start writing for people and trying to have readers, often you're you're doing business. You're in a relationship of commerce, and so who's going to publish you? And I have found that you know, the kind of more experimental, you know, metafiction and maximalist fiction that I most love to write is not. There's not that many places that want to publish that. But what I do know is that there's a desire and a need for someone who's transgender and who can write to be doing that work. I remember when I first started writing for the opinion section at the Times, Anna Quinlan wrote me and she said, A, congratulations, and B, remember that sometimes you're going to have to write about things because no one else is going to write about them on that page. And I'm not the only trans person who's ever appeared on the opinion section, obviously, but I'm the only transgender person with a regular birth on the page. So there are times when I feel like, well, you know, I've got to write about this because I don't know if anybody else will, and certainly nobody else with the birth that I had there is going to write it. So I feel, and the same thing is true of the books that I want to write. To the extent that I want to find readers, if I'm writing about trans issues, that's the thing I can publish. So that kind of connects to what you were saying before, in that to find readers, often to me, I know that to some degree that limits what I can write about. And to me, that's really frustrating. Because, I mean, when I wrote She's Not There, my memoir 20 years ago, I figured, well, I'll write this one book about transition, and then I'll be done with the whole trans thing, and I'll go back to writing fiction. And I've written novels since then, but there's transgender characters in there. And not only because that's the experience that I know, it's also because I know that's what my publishers are looking for. So it's all wrapped up in commerce too, and that, to me personally, it's a little frustrating, actually.
John's looking at me, so I have to go. I think to answer your question, what's being lost, or the danger of what's being lost, is the story of America. And what do I mean by that? I feel like for many of us, the story that we've been told about America is a fiction. Manifest destiny. Pull yourself up from the bootstraps. Rick Santorum went on and said that we came here, there was nothing, right? And we built this country. And then you can just play a rock and roll song from the 80s, right, in the background. And for the rest of us, that's always been a fiction. And we've always tried to add the narrators and the protagonists and the chapters to this expanding story and reveal the real American story. What's being banned right now as we speak is CRT, which I took in law school as an elective, which in Virginia, where I live with 2 kids in the elementary school, is not being taught. I know because I have kids. It's not even in the lesson plan, but has been used deliberately as an excuse now to ban books. I mentioned it in the 7-minute talk, not 5-minute talk I gave. Forgive me, Suzanne. She's never going to invite me again. 850 books. And if you look at those lists of 850 books, those are dangerous books like Handmaid's Tale, or dangerous books, Ta-Nehisi Coates' essays, right? Really scary books by black, brown men and women, right? Which try to put in narratives that were often excised and stamped out, like Toni Morrison's Beloved
we're fine with AK-47s in school, but God forbid if your child reads Toni Morrison's Beloved. And so in this reclamation project of white supremacy, which is what we're undergoing right now in this country, which men have to be on top, straight men have to be on top, white men have to be on top, and they need that fiction to fuel this narrative of this country. The rest of us threaten that. And so I worry right now, this is like the loggerheads right now. We're in Act 2, Empire Strikes Back, literally. And that George Floyd protest, like we said, 2 steps forward in America, 1 step back. The Reclamation Project is right back after the George Floyd protests. For the rest of us, I think this is going to be messy. And it's going to be a test to see what's the story of this country. Are we going to expand and stretch, or are we going to constrict? And that, to me, is the big story moving forward.
John, do you want to?
Suzanne, you should keep going, because I agree with too much of what they said.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. I want to take some questions from our audience. I think Nancy is here with a mic, and I hope you'll join in. And if there are any questions, there's one over here, Nancy, and then I think there's some coming from the chat.
Thank you, by the way, everyone, for coming. I hope you guys weren't bored. No? Bueller? Yes? We got golf clap? We got... All right.
Just want to make sure. So first of all, thank you all for doing this and for coming around here. My question is about... my question is for Professor McWhorter. You talk a lot about in your book that how like woke racism kind of treats African Americans as delicate and too soft. What would you say to all the African American people in that movement who participate in it? Are you saying that there's something wrong with them or anything about that?
No, I don't think that there's anything wrong with anybody for the most part. But I think that it's easy to lose sight of the harm that certain attitudes can do. And so if you're focused on bias against black boys and suspensions for violence, then it's one thing to listen to the people who say that bias is the main cause of the disproportion. But if there's a literature that shows that that doesn't actually hold true when you look at these sorts of things in whole citywide surveys, and that actually black kids who aren't committing acts of violence in the schools are being hurt by the ones who are, then there's a new lens that's involved. And I see the idea that one should only think of the bias even when there's harm being done to black kids in the name of what we're being told to think of. That's something that needs to be called attention to. And in terms of the delicacy, if there is a philosophy, for example, that any time a black person says that racism is involved, that absolutely must be true. I fully understand the impulse to think that given what we black people have been through over the past 400 years, that's the civil position to take, that one should not split hairs, or certainly that racism is such an easy thing to identify that why would there be any question? But the thing is, this is the inconvenient thing. It's inconvenient and it's depressing and it's difficult. But especially in our times, identifying what is racism and what isn't is not easy. I so wish it was, but it isn't. It's subtle, it's confounding, there's Rashomon, there are different perspectives. And unfortunately, there are times when a black person may say that racism is involved when, in terms of the judgment of reasonable people, it wasn't, including a lot of black people if you ask them. To propose that that's not true because of the brutal history of this country and the fact that racism does exist is an infantilization, because that's something that we only apply when it comes to how we judge black people. And frankly, I would even say that if the history of the human species is 300,000 years, it's new to allow that of one particular group because of history, that there can be no question about such things. That is, quite unintentionally, it's not about malevolence, it's treating black people like children. It's a kind of pity. I don't want to use that phrase, the soft bigotry of low expectations, but I guess I just did. And so,
To the extent that there are black people who would disagree with me, I fully respect it, but I also consider my view to be legitimate because I think that we are encouraged to think of that infantilization as a kind of respect. I can't see it any other way, and I insist on putting that view out there because, and I'm done, because I think that that's a very ordinary view among black people, especially beyond the academy and the media. And I know that because I have a family and I grew up with black friends. So I'm not expressing my weird cardigan view. I'm expressing what I think of as a black view that doesn't get out there enough from people who happen to have my kind of pulpit.
Thank you. Thanks to all the speakers that are here today. At first I was a little apprehensive to even ask this question and almost self-censored myself, but I want to consider myself a man of the right. For that reason, I do believe that we should turn the mirror around and look at it ourselves for a second as a left-leaning person. I guess the two-part question is...
There's a request that you take off your mask.
Okay, sorry. It's a two-part question. Do you think that in more left-leaning areas that are owned by liberal spaces, such as universities, NPR, areas like that, where there's often a lot of diversity, do you think there is a lack of diversity in thought? And if so, do you think a lot of professors and students are self-censoring themselves? And if that is happening, what is the lasting implications to the students and to our institutions? Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to?
Is that me
again? Go ahead, but I hope others might.
Yes. Yes, there is that self-censorship, and there can be no question. The point is that most people don't think in the way that you're thinking about. But in university culture, yes, professors self-censor, students self-censor. So for example, I'm supposedly such a renegade in my views in writing a book like that. Daily, I get some sort of missive from a professor saying, I appreciate what you're saying, and very few of them are right-wingers. I got one on the train here today from a fellow linguist, and I know very well that he would never want the linguistics community to know that he had written that to me, but he's typical, literally every day. And I'll tell you something depressing. I had 2 Columbia undergraduates who worked under me and graduated, both of them about 5 years ago. And independently, the 2 of them, they were friends, the 2 of them independently wrote me a few weeks ago, and they said they'd been reading some of my stuff lately. And they said they get it. One of them said, I would never have said any of these things while I was at Columbia because I didn't want my head to be cut off. And I remember her well. She was a Democrat, she was a liberal, but she didn't agree with the hard, radical leftist views that were being thought of as settled questions rather than up for debate. That's the issue. And another one said, she has a certain sarcastic sense of humor, but she said the main thing she got out of her Columbia education was learning when to keep her mouth shut. And again, she, hated Donald Trump, was a person of the left, but that was the college situation she knew. That's the way it is. But it's not most people. It's that the people who think that way are frightening because they call you a white supremacist on Twitter or on whatever the campus, the campus communication vehicle is. So that's the issue. But yes, there can be no doubt that is the way it is.
Anyone else want to chime in?
I would like to chime in. Right now, these liberal professors aren't banning CRT. There's no list of books that they're banning. They're not encouraging or pressuring libraries to ban books by right-wing authors. That's just not happening. Right now, if you see in Florida, like I said before, the University of Florida released a report where these liberals are self-censoring themselves because of the wrath of Ron DeSantis, who's all about the First Amendment and free speech and my body and my rights, but he's against vaccine mandates, but he's going to punish individual businesses who have vaccine mandates, and he's punished counties for vaccine passports, and he's fighting schools who want to protect their kids from this thing called coronavirus that has killed 5 million people. And I can tell you from my industry, media industry specifically, New York Times and even the CNN, that there's affirmative action for conservatives. They get to fail up all the time. Rick Santorum, who was my colleague, gets to say the craziest shit, got paid really well, failed up. I got 4 warnings in CNN. If you've ever seen me on CNN, I never raise my voice, I never swear. I'm energetic, as you have seen. I have some humor. Some people think it's funny, some people hate me. That's fine. The 4 warnings came because my 4 conservative colleagues whined to my senior producer and said, he criticizes too hard. Never from the left, right? In New York Times, the person who snitched on me and tried to get me fired, and he did this to a lot of women and other journalists, was, anyone want to take a guess? Bret Stephens, the person who complains about safe spaces and these fragile snowflake liberals and says, just man up and take it. Every single time a colleague criticized one of his pieces using their First Amendment right, he used to email the masthead to get us in trouble. And that happened with women and people of color in particular, and we had to self-censor ourselves, Suzanne, because we realized he was untouchable. And a colleague of mine one time said, I got so pissed off, because once I was about to say something, and I'm like, I found out from a person who was trying to do a report on this in Washington Post, and another journalist, we got 4 or 5 journalists like you who are afraid to come out because they know Brett's untouched. Can you be the first one to come out? And I was like, F this, man, I'm gonna call this out. And then other Muslims in the media said, you're the only Muslim writer in the New York Times. You're too important to us. No one's gonna have your back. And I sat there with cowardice, because my wife said, Wajahat, we need this job right now. I sat there with cowardice. I was so pissed off at myself. And then finally this whole Tom Kahn thing happened. I'm like, F it. I did a whole thread. All these people came out of the woodworks. You know many of these writers. Bret Stephens is still there, failing up. So there's still affirmative action. I just want to give the counterpoint to that point. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
All right, thank you. I think we'll take just one more question because I know we...
It's short.
Go ahead. We are over time. Thank you so much. Go ahead.
I get the impression you all seem to agree that Twitter is bad, and I was wondering if any, or perhaps all of you had considered boycotting it, or just not being on it. Would that be difficult?
I am not.
We've silenced you because you're about to say something bad
She's been canceled.
And they're one of our sponsors. No, just kidding.
I did exactly that, actually. Halfway through this year, I was so frustrated by the exact thing that I have been talking about this entire time that I got off Twitter. I was like, I'm absolutely done. And I just did it. And it was the best choice I ever made. And I just decided, I'm not going to give a corporation my thoughts for free so that it can art can actively be degraded in front of my face. I just simply won't do that anymore. So
yeah, but that's again a question of commerce, because if you're a writer, if you're a mid-list writer, which is kind of the nice word for what I am, your publisher and your publicist and all the people who are trying to publish your book, they want you to be on Twitter, they want you to be on Facebook, they want you to have a platform. And so it's funny, it used to be that the job of an author was writing a book. And now you write a book, and then your job is you're in the business of self-promotion. And it's such a miserable business. So I'm on Twitter because I have to be. At least that's the way I've been given to understand it. Facebook as well, and I go on there because that's the business of writing, and I don't want to let my publisher down, and I don't want to, I do like to engage with the readers who like me, but it can be a really demeaning experience, and I would get off of it if I was as brave as you are.
I just as a counterpoint, I 100,000% agree and understand, just needing to survive. No one needs to be on Twitter. no one needs to be. And like, I understand what you're saying. You're saying you're the perspective of like, my publisher wants me to be, I don't know, fuck your publisher. Like, tell your publisher to go fuck themselves if they tell you to be on Twitter. Like, I don't. Again, I'm saying this with all the, like, I understand exactly what you're saying, and like the demands of capitalism, the demands of the commerce of the thing. Like, a lot of people feel pressure and feel the need to like have a platform, but I believe that a fiction writer's job or a writer's job is to write good books.
To write a book.
Yeah, it's literally to write a book. And like, I think it's bullshit that we've like created this narrative where it's like you have to like have these platforms and like have a thought about every single weird little thread that's like going through this like massive company every single day. It's like you're just giving free labor, like you're just like writing free shit for this company that does not care about you in any way and is just like profiting off of your free work. So again, I 1,000% understand and agree with what you're saying in terms of the need for that, but I also think that nobody should be on Twitter.
I feel like these are two angels because these are the conversations I'm having right now. Literally in my head as I'm trying to promote the book. Speaking about the messiness, I'm like, yes, yes.
You know, actually, I think about leaving Twitter probably about every month because I resisted it longer than most people in my position because I could tell, watching people, especially in the early teens, if you're really into Twitter, you stop actually reading books. You simply don't have the time. You start reading Twitter and you only skim books. And I wanted to keep reading books. But it did get to the point, it's not only your publisher, but just if you're not on it at all, to an extent you don't exist, as in you're not asked to do things, you're not considered part of the conversation. I think it was John Avalon at the Daily Beast in 15 when I said, I don't want to be on Twitter because I like books. And he said, no, if you're not on Twitter and you're writing articles, it's like you're working with one arm behind your back. And I think he was right, and so I started jumping in, and so I use it to publish my stuff. But I must admit, I see a lot of people who do what I do who clearly are on Twitter all day and participating in these threads and getting their feelings hurt and smacking people down and doing it well. There are people who are very good at Twitter. But I can tell, with all due respect to those people, and I'm thinking of really smart people in the media, like some of the 200 IQs, that person couldn't have time to ever actually read a book at this point. Because Twitter is so seductive. And I don't want to become that person, and so I try to use it very surgically. During the pandemic, I would get bored sometimes, and I started participating in some fights. And boy, was that not a good look. I would wake up in the morning and I'd think, why did I say that to that person? And so I've stopped doing that. But yeah, Twitter is a scourge. I mean, there was a life before Twitter when you could just read. But I must admit, I do look at it 6 or 7 times a day, and I don't think I could stop. But it is a really dangerous drug. Yeah. I think I'm going to get off of Twitter.
I'll have to check tomorrow who exactly is back on Twitter, how many recidivists we have on our panel. So with that, it's time to close. We've gone over, and thank you for your patience to our audience and our panelists. You know, I guess just a closing comment from the PEN perspective. You know, we don't really think in terms of a precise hierarchy of threats to free expression. We are looking at a constantly evolving landscape, and one of the things that has been so shocking when I came to PEN, book bans, I was surprised the organization still worked on book bans. It seemed so archaic, and book bans were something we did with kind of one finger and a volunteer committee, our children's book writers who are represented here in the audience, and we would maybe send a letter, you know, once a month, maybe a few times a year. But we kept a little finger on it, and, you know, then who knew? All of a sudden, in the last few months, it has bubbled up absolutely into being a proximate threat and overt censorship, you know, at a level and to a degree that we have not seen before. And so I would just say, you know, while we constantly struggle to prioritize, I wouldn't take any threat to free expression kind of off the table on the grounds that, you know, there's something else that's more important. I think we have to exercise a kind of vigilance. And some of what we heard tonight, I think, was eye-opening. It was forms of self-censorship that I'm not sure any of us had necessarily really focused on before. So on behalf of PEN America, I really want to thank all of you for a terrific conversation. And if you're here with us in the room, please join us upstairs for some drinks and a bite and a chance to chew on all of this. Thank you so much for coming.